Welcome to this section on Freud's model of personality. Before we start, let me tell you a little bit about Freud the man. Now, Freud is probably one of the most famous people associated with the field of psychology. And when your relatives hear that you're taking a course in psychology, one of the first things they're likely to say is, "Oh, Freud, right?" As if that's what the field is all about. Ironically, Freud was not really even a psychologist. He was a physician and didn't do any research in what would have then been considered psychology. But his ideas about human nature and the work that he did with patients suffering from mental disorders became incorporated into the field. So to this day, Freud is still a very influential figure, at least in the field of therapy, not so influential among researchers. Having said that, let me say a little bit about his life. He was born in 1856 in what is now known as the Czech Republic. His family was Jewish. Freud was one of 10 children, but his father had 3 different wives, so the 10 children were kind of divided up among 3 different mothers. The father was also a wool salesman. Freud lived in what is now the Czech Republic until he was about 4 years old, and then his family moved to Vienna. And Freud spent almost his entire life in Vienna until 1939. Just before the Nazis took over, Freud escaped to London and only lived a few more months after he got there. So, for all intents and purposes, he spent his life in Vienna. Even if you don't know much about Freud, you know that there are a lot of jokes about your feelings about your mother being related to Freudian analysis. And in fact, Freud himself was spoiled shamelessly by his mother. His mother recognized that he was a brilliant student and knew he was destined to become a great man. So he had all kinds of favorite treatment that other children in the family didn't get. For example, he was the only one to have his own room. He was the only one to have his own study lamp. His sister played the piano, but the music bothered Freud, so the mother had the piano taken away. So in all kinds of ways, Freud was certainly his mother's favorite. And the mother was certainly onto something. Freud was very precocious as a child. He was a brilliant student, had a wide range of interests. And after he became a physician, he became one of the world experts on diagnosing brain damage. He also experimented extensively on the effects of cocaine, using himself as a subject much of the time. And of course, the thing that we remember him for most is his development of psychoanalysis, which I will talk about quite a bit in a little while. So that's some background information about Freud. Now let's talk about his view of human nature and how the personality worked. According to Freud, all of our motivation is due to what he called the pleasure principle. We're driven to seek pleasure. And for Freud, all pleasure was ultimately sexual pleasure. You may enjoy yourself by eating a good meal or watching an interesting movie or just spending time with friends, but if it's a pleasurable experience, ultimately you're sexually gratifying yourself, according to Freud, although we consciously are not aware that that's the case. And I will come back to this issue in a little bit. But for the time being, we're driven to action by our need to seek pleasure. And this need to seek pleasure is driven by something he called the sex instinct. Its formal name is eros. Libido is the name of the energies generated by eros that makes us do whatever we do. So when you get up in the morning to do anything, it's because your libidinal energy is spurring you on to seek pleasure that day. Freud thought of eros as an essentially positive force. All of the good things that get done in the world is essentially the result of rechanneled sexual energy. And so this sex instinct that he talked about was not a bad thing. Very late in his career, Freud started to develop a notion of another part of the personality known as thanatos. For want of a better way to describe it, I'll use Star Wars terminology. This is our dark side. Freud was kind of traumatized by what he saw in World War I. He thought of eros as a very positive force, and he couldn't reconcile that as being the only source of our motivation with the cruelty and aggression and violence that he saw on such a wide scale in World War I. So he began to think that we must have some other part of us, some darker part that he called thanatos, which is the death instinct. It's an instinct to be aggressive and violent. This aggression can be channeled outward toward other people, but it could also be turned upon oneself, and you can become sort of masochistic or suicidal. Anyway, Freud never had a chance to completely develop his idea of thanatos because he died before he had a chance to really go very far with it. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore. For our purposes, think of Eros as the driving force in human lives. A key component of Freud's theory of personality is the principle of the principle of psychic determinism. According to Freud, nothing happens by chance. Every random thought you have, the things that you forget, the dreams that you have, any self-inflicted injuries or bungled words, all of these things have a cause. All of these actions that seem to be mistakes really are a symptom of something else. So everything that happens for a reason. There is no chance in our behavior, according to Freud. And an important part of his notion of human nature was something he called the unconscious. That's that part of the personality that's completely inaccessible to the person. We don't even know it's there. Freud's view of human nature is often represented in a diagram like this that's come to be known as the mental iceberg model. I'm sure most of you know that as large as they might look sticking up out of the ocean, almost all of the iceberg is beneath the surface of the water. And the part that you see sticking out, the visible part, is just a small part of the iceberg. So if you want to think of the part above the water as your conscious level, this is the stuff that you are aware of right now. The perceptions you're having, the thoughts that you're having, everything that's in your consciousness and awareness is the part above the surface of the water. Freud also referred to something called the preconscious. So there are a lot of things that you're not thinking of right now. There are a lot of memories and knowledge that you have that you're not aware of at the moment. But you could retrieve these things. You could become aware of them given the right cues. And these are just below the surface of the water. And these would be things that are in the preconscious level. Deep down is where the unconscious is. The unconscious level is where our irrational fears and immoral urges, our violent motives, all of the shameful, disgusting stuff about ourselves can be found. We are unaware that it's there. It plays a very important part in our life, but there's no way we can access it even if we wish to. As you might suspect, from Freud's point of view, most of the really interesting stuff that happens in our personality happens at the level of the unconscious. According to Freud, the personality is divided into three parts. The first part is the id. This is the only part of your personality that's present at birth, and Freud likened it to a seething cauldron which contained ever-bubbling primitive urges and desires. This is where your instincts are, and this is where the total supply of your psychic energy comes from. The id is entirely conscious. We don't know it exists. We're not aware of any of the things that's going on in there. And the id is completely irrational, impulsive, and selfish. The id only knows that it seeks pleasure, and it's pushing and driving for that kind of gratification all of the time. It doesn't have any conception of reality or morality. It doesn't know what's possible. It doesn't know what's right and wrong. The only kind of thinking the id can do is something called primary process thought. It can form crude mental images of things that will provide satisfaction for it, and it drives us to seek those things. Sometimes artists on campus will come over to the psych department and ask us about primary process thought. Apparently in the arts, there's some idea that if you can tap into this, you can be a more creative person. And they're usually a little disappointed that none of us are Freudians and don't really have a whole lot to say about primary process thought. The next part of the personality is the ego. It begins to develop around 6 to 8 months of age, and unlike the id, the ego is sane and it's rational. The ego can distinguish your images, the fantasy life that you have, from what's out there in reality. And it's the ego's job to formulate realistic plans to deal with the desire of the id. One analogy that I've heard that I've kind of liked to express the relationship between the id and the superego is that the id is like this wild horse, bucking and kicking and dashing in one direction or another, almost directionless. The ego is the rider who's sitting on top of this horse, desperately holding onto the reins, trying to not get thrown off the horse, trying to steer the horse in the desired direction. And so the ego is constantly doing battle with the id, trying to allow the id some gratification, not to let it exceed what is possible. The ego does not make moral judgments. The ego operates according to something called the reality principle. It knows what's possible and what's not. It engages in logical thinking, known as secondary process thought. And the ego is the thing that keeps you from getting in trouble by letting your id run wild. And when you experience anxiety, it's the ego's response to threats from anything that's the source of anxiety. And there are different types of anxiety. Sometimes you have anxiety about threats from the actual real world, and this is called objective or realistic anxiety. On the other hand, sometimes we have anxiety because your id impulses seem like they're about to get out of control. This is called neurotic anxiety. And sometimes anxiety is the result of an overly severe superego. You're feeling guilty all the time. This is called moral anxiety. And this is a good segue into the superego. The superego is that part of you that incorporates notions of right and wrong. It's kind of observing what you do and sits in judgment over the id and the superego. It incorporates the standards of right and wrong that your culture endorse and makes you feel guilty if you violate those. It also is the place where your ego ideal resides. This is your fantasy notion of the kind of person you want to be. The perfect body, the perfect soul, the whole 9 yards. And if you don't live up to that, the superego punishes you with guilt. So you've got to kind of feel sorry for the poor ego. On the one hand, it's trying to control this wild bucking horse, but at the same time, it's trying to satisfy this prudish moral judge that's looking over its shoulder. And this constant battle between the different parts of the personality is the thing that results in who you are and how you behave. Freud's model of the personality is called a psychodynamic model because everything that occurs is the result of the dynamic pushing back and forth between these different parts of the personality. Some people have stronger ids than others. Some people have more well-developed superegos than others. Some have more competent egos than others. And it's the interplay of these three parts of the personality that dictate what happens. When the ego begins to feel that it's losing control, it resorts to all kinds of tricks to keep the anxiety at arm's length and to prevent you from doing undesirable things. And the tools that it uses are called defense mechanisms. These are the ego's way of managing anxiety. And they're positive things. Sometimes people who don't know a lot about Freud's theory will derisively say to someone, well, that's just a defense mechanism, as if the person was doing something wrong or relying on some faulty thing. According to Freud, defense mechanisms are absolutely essential because without them, we would be overwhelmed by anxiety. There are dozens of different defense mechanisms, dozens of different ways in which we can keep things from coming into our consciousness. And I'm not going to talk very much about those. Your book discusses them in quite a bit of detail. So I want you to be familiar with what defense mechanisms are and how they operate. But when your defense mechanisms break down, when they're not functioning very well anymore, that's the point at which we need to seek professional help. That's when we need to seek psychoanalysis. I will talk about psychoanalysis in much more detail later in the course when we talk about the treatment of mental disorders. But I can't talk about Freud without briefly mentioning it here. Psychoanalysis is a specific style of therapy, and it's part of a type of therapy known as insight therapies. The person doesn't get better until they experience some sort of insight. They have an aha moment where they understand what's going on. And in psychoanalysis, the goal is to get the person to get insight into what's going on in the unconscious. And this allows us to achieve something called catharsis, this intense emotional release. If you've ever seen a bad movie about Freudian theory, it almost always ends with one of the characters rolled up on the floor in a fetal position, sobbing and yelling. That's sort of what catharsis is supposed to be all about. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to help people who are paralyzed by anxiety find out why their defense mechanisms are breaking down by digging down into the unconscious to get at the root of the problem. You can't do this on your own. You need the help of a trained psychoanalyst. I will return to this again later in the course, but keep in mind that psychoanalysis is a very specific kind of psychotherapy. Sometimes people use the term psychoanalysis and psychotherapy interchangeably, but psychotherapy is a very general term that applies to any type of therapy a person could be engaging in. Psychoanalysis is very specifically therapy guided by Freudian theory and making assumptions about human nature that come from Freud's theory. Some of the common tools of psychoanalysis are hypnosis, free association, where the person just sort of lays there on the couch, as you see in the movies, just kind of speaking aimlessly, and the therapist is looking for signs of resistance. When the person doesn't seem to want to go somewhere, the therapist will occasionally ask a question or steer them back. The analysis of dreams is also a very important part of psychoanalysis, and I will talk about this in the module on consciousness in the course. But Freud believed that through our dreams, a lot of the things that are unconscious to us can be detected by analyzing the symbolisms of what's happening in the dreams. But more about that later.